than it should have been, my fingers stiff from 10 hours of constant motion. I felt a bead of sweat roll down my spine, cold and distracting. "Sloane!" Arthur's bark came from across the room, sharp as a whip crack. Flinch. It was a small movement, a momentary lapse in the ironclad focus I'd maintained all day. But in a room where perfection was the only currency, a flinch was a bankruptcy. My hip caught the edge of a mahogany chair, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. The tray tilted. The crystal glass, fragile and expensive as a secret, began its slow, inevitable slide toward the floor. The glass was mid-air when the heavy brass doors of the Gilded Lotus swung open, cutting through the stagnant luxury of the room with a gust of ozone and freezing rain. The shift was instantaneous. It wasn't just the drop in temperature. It was the sudden, pressurized silence that followed, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room to make space for someone else. The glass hit the carpet with a dull thud, remarkably unbroken, but the water inside splashed across Arthur's polished Italian loafers. He didn't scream. He didn't even breathe. His face, I had exactly 60 seconds before my shift ended, and his life did. The silver tray in my hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds, the single crystal wine glass rattling against the metal as my pulse hammered in my fingertips. I could feel Arthur's eyes on me from across the floor, predatory, cold, waiting for a single stumble so he could finally pull the trigger on my career. He didn't know that while he was watching me, I was watching the exit. Around us, the restaurant breathed with the suffocating rhythm of the ultra-rich. The low clink of silver, the heavy scent of expensive lilies, and the golden glow of the chandeliers reflecting off the rain-slicked windows. Outside, a Chicago thunderstorm was tearing the sky apart, but in here, the air was still and thick with the smell of old money and new blood. I stepped toward the corner booth like I was walking into a firing squad. Kaito Vane sat there, framed by the lightning flashing behind the glass. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a monument. His black suit was sharp enough to cut, his unbuttoned collar revealing the dark ink of a dragon that seemed to pulse against his throat with every breath. He wasn't even looking at the menu. He was looking at the room, his gaze a calculated sweep that missed nothing. One more step. That was all it took for the glass to tilt. That was all it took for the world to break. The tray felt like a lead weight, the muscles in my forearm twitching with a fatigue that went bone deep. It was 11:45 p.m., the tail end of a double shift that had started before the sun was even up, and my sensible black flats had long since stopped offering anything resembling comfort. Every step across the polished marble of the Gilded Lotus felt like walking on broken glass. I could feel the humidity of the Chicago storm clinging to my skin, a damp contrast to the dry, filtered air of the dining room where the scent of aged wagyu and expensive perfume hung thick enough to choke on. I didn't need to look toward the maitre d' station to know Arthur Sterling was watching. I could feel his gaze like a cold draft on the back of my neck. Arthur didn't just manage the restaurant. He policed it with a quiet, refined malice that made every server feel like a prisoner on temporary leave. To him, I wasn't Sloane Whitaker, a nursing student 3 semesters away from a life that didn't involve carrying other people's leftovers. I was a variable, a dark spot on his otherwise pristine floor. Table 12 needs a refill on the sparkling Sloane. Move like you actually want to keep this job. His voice was a low, jagged hiss as I passed him. He didn't even look at me. His eyes fixed on a smudge on a nearby silver spoon that only he could see. "I'm on it, Mr. Sterling," I murmured, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. "And fix your collar," he added, his lip curling in a way that signaled his growing impatience. "You look like you've been dragged through the rain. This is a 5-star establishment, not a soup kitchen. If you can't maintain the aesthetic, I'll find someone who can buy tomorrow morning." I adjusted the stiff white fabric with my free hand, my fingers trembling slightly. The threat wasn't empty. Arthur had been looking for a reason to cut me since the day I'd asked for a weekend off to study for my finals. He hated that I had a world outside these glass walls, a world that didn't revolve around his meticulous seating charts and vintage wine lists. I navigated the floor, the golden light of the chandeliers blurring in my vision. My back ached, a sharp, stabbing heat between my shoulder blades that made every breath a chore. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the room, the soft clink of silver, the hushed, arrogant laughter of the men in $5,000 suits, but the exhaustion was starting to win. My peripheral vision was tunneling, the world shrinking down to the circular edge of my silver tray and the single tall crystal glass sitting dead center. I reached for the bottle of chilled water, my hand slick with condensation. My grip was less sure, usually a mask of controlled irritation, went a peculiar shade of gray as his eyes fixed on the man stepping out of the storm. Kaito Vane didn't walk into a room. He claimed it. He stood at the entrance for a heartbeat, the dark fabric of his overcoat glistening with rainwater that looked like liquid diamonds under the chandeliers. He was tall, his silhouette sharp and predatory, but it was the stillness that was truly terrifying. Behind him, two men in identical charcoal suits fanned out, their movements synchronized and silent, eyes scanning the dining floor with a detached efficiency of high-end weaponry. "Mr. Vane," Arthur stammered, his voice losing its jagged edge and becoming a desperate, oily trill. He stepped over the puddle I'd made, ignoring me entirely as he rushed toward the entrance. "We didn't expect. That is, your reservation was for the private suite upstairs." Kaito didn't look at Arthur. He didn't even acknowledge the manager's existence. He began to move toward the center of the room, his black leather shoes silent on the marble. As he passed me, the unbuttoned collar of his shirt shifted, revealing the tail of a dragon tattoo that coiled upward, disappearing behind his ear like a dark promise. He smelled of rain, expensive tobacco, and a cold, metallic sort of power that made the hair on my arms stand up. I remained on one knee, my fingers still touching the damp carpet where the water had pooled. From this low vantage point, the world felt even more dangerous. The other diners, people who usually treated me like a piece of the furniture, had stopped talking. Forks were lowered. Wine glasses remained mid-air. The jazz quartet in the corner drifted into a low, mournful bridge, the cello humming a warning I could feel in my marrow. Kaito stopped at table 1. He didn't wait for Arthur to pull out the chair. He sat down with his back to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the city's skyline shimmering behind his head like a jagged, electric crown. Lightning split the sky again, a brilliant white flash that turned his features into a stark, monochromatic study of bone and shadow. His gaze finally settled, but not on the menu Arthur was frantically trying to present. He looked directly at me, still kneeling, still sacked in Arthur's mind, still clutching a tray like a shield. His eyes were obsidian, unreadable and deep, assessing the mess on the floor and the girl caught in the middle of it. In that moment, the exhaustion that had been dragging me down was replaced by a sharp, cold clarity. The predator hadn't just arrived to eat. He was watching the room, and I realized with a jolt of pure ice in my chest that he wasn't the only one. The silence Kaito Vane brought with him was fragile, a thin sheet of ice that Arthur Sterling was about to shatter with a sledgehammer. My fingers were still pressed against the damp carpet, the cold water seeping into my skin, when Arthur's shadow fell over me. It was dark, heavy, and smelled of the desperate desperation of a man trying to save face in front of a king. "Get up," Arthur hissed. The oily tone he had used for Kaito was gone, replaced by a jagged, vibrating fury. "Get up right now." I scrambled to my feet, the silver tray clutched against my chest like a shield. My legs felt like lead, and my heart was a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ribs. I didn't look at Kaito, but I could feel his gaze, a weight at the center of my forehead, steady and unblinking. "I'm sorry, Mr. Sterling." "Sure. You just proved exactly what I've been saying for months," Arthur cut me off, his voice rising, intentionally loud enough to carry across the hushed dining room. He wanted the elite, the powerful, and most importantly, the man at table 1 to see him cleaning house. He wanted them to see that he had standards, even if those standards meant stepping on a girl who was already down. "You are a clumsy, incompetent girl who has no business standing on this floor." He stepped closer, his face contorting into a mask of theatrical disgust. He pointed a trembling finger at the spilled water near Kaito's feet. "You've embarrassed this establishment. You've insulted our guests. Look at you, trembling, pathetic. Your mess, Sloane. A dark, ugly stain on my reputation." I felt the heat rise to my face, a burning shame that made my vision blur. The tears I had been holding back since 6 a.m. were threatening to spill. Every pair of eyes in the room was on me, some curious, some bored, but most looked through me as if I were already gone. "I'll clean it up, sir," I whispered, my voice breaking. I reached for the fallen glass, but Arthur's foot shot out, kicking it further away. The crystal skidded across the marble, a sharp, lonely sound. "You won't clean anything," Arthur roared, his arm fully extended now, his finger inches from my nose. "You're done. Fired. Take that apron off and get out. Don't go to the back. Don't collect your things. I'll have them mailed to whatever hole you crawled out of. You are a failure, Sloane Whitaker. Now, get out of my sight before I have security drag you through the rain." The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing me down toward the floor I had just been cleaning. My throat felt like it was filled with sand. I turned to leave, my head bowed, the posture of a girl who had finally been broken. But as I turned, my eyes caught a movement, not from Arthur, but from the tables surrounding Kaito Vane. 3 men in gray suits were rising, their hands sliding inside their jackets in a synchronized lethal grace. The world slowed down. Arthur was still shouting, his mouth moving in a silent, ugly snarl, but all I could see was the glint of steel beneath a napkin. I wasn't a failure yet. I was the only person in the room who knew the blood was about to start flowing. The weight of Arthur's words should have been the only thing crushing me, but as I lowered myself back toward the carpet, a different kind of pressure settled over the room. Arthur was still standing over me, his chest heaving with the self-important satisfaction of a man who had finally exerted total control. He was waiting for me to slink away, to disappear into the rain and the shadows of a life he considered beneath him. But my hands, reaching for the remaining shards of crystal, froze. From my position on the floor, the world of the Gilded Lotus shifted. The perspective of a servant is usually limited to the heights of tabletops and the shine of shoes, but in the silence of my sacking, I saw the gaps in the perfection. At table 4, a man who had been nursing a vintage Bordeaux all night wasn't looking at his wine. His body was angled toward table 1. His right shoulder dropped, his hand disappearing into the dark void of a custom-tailored jacket. To his left, 2 others rose with a mechanical, terrifying grace. There was no conversation between them, no shared glances. They moved with the cold, synchronized intent of a wolf pack closing the distance. I looked at Arthur. He was still preening, oblivious to the steel glinting under the soft glow of the chandelier just 10 feet behind him. Then I looked at Kaito Vane. He sat perfectly still, his obsidian eyes fixed on me. He didn't look like a man about to die. He looked like a man waiting to see what I would do. My heart felt like a trapped thing, battering against my ribs. The internal debate was a frantic, jagged mess. Could leave. I could take the humiliation Arthur had heaped on me, walk out those brass doors and never look back. Men like Kaito Vane lived in a world of blood and shadows. Perhaps this was just the natural end to a life of violence. If I stayed silent, I was safe. I was just a fired waitress, a stain on the carpet that the cleaners would scrub away by morning. But then I saw the man at table 4 adjust his grip. The movement was small, a slight tensing of the forearm, but it was enough. If I walked away, I wasn't just leaving a job. I was leaving my humanity. I thought of my father, of the nurses who sat with him when I couldn't, of the small, quiet acts of mercy that kept the world from spinning into total darkness. Mercy wasn't for the deserving. It was for the living. Arthur's foot moved, nudging me again. I said, "Get out, Sloane. Are you deaf as well as useless?" I didn't answer him. I didn't even look at him. I gathered the last of the glass, the sharp edges biting into my palm, drawing a thin line of red that I barely felt. I began to crawl, not away from the table but toward it. Toward the man with the dragon tattoo and the death sentence hanging over his head. The silver lining wasn't the job I was losing. It was the fact that for the first time in my life, I was the only one who could see the invisible. I moved forward, my knees scraping against the hard marble, a posture that Arthur clearly mistook for a final, desperate plea for my job. He loomed over me, his shadow a dark weight. His voice a jagged edge of insults that I had stopped hearing. My world had narrowed down to the glint of steel at table 4 and the unblinking obsidian eyes of Kaito Vane. As I reached the edge of Kaito's table, the air seemed to grow colder, thick with the scent of rain and a sharp metallic tension. I began to gather the remaining shards of glass near his feet, my hands moving with a mechanical precision that masked the frantic hammering of my heart. Arthur stepped closer, his polished shoe inches from my hand. His face contorted in a sneer. "Look at her," Arthur mocked, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "Still clinging to the floor like a stray. Have some dignity, Sloane. Get out." Kaito Vane leaned forward then. It was a slow, deliberate movement that silenced Arthur mid-breath. He didn't look at the manager. He looked down at me. His presence a towering force that seemed to push the rest of the room into the background. To the onlookers, it looked like a powerful man about to deliver a final, crushing rebuke to a clumsy servant. He reached out, his long, tattooed fingers grasping the edge of the mahogany table, his body shielding me from Arthur's direct line of sight. The dragon on his neck seemed to shimmer in the low light as he lowered his head, his face inches from mine. I could see the fine lines of his suit, the gold cross resting against his skin, and the terrifyingly calm depth in his eyes. This was the moment. The internal debate died, replaced by a cold, sharp necessity. "The men at table 4, I whispered, the words barely more than a breath, my lips barely moving as I pretended to reach for a fragment of crystal near his boot. "They aren't here for the steak, Mr. Vane. They're reaching for their jackets. They're here for you." I felt his body stiffen, not with fear, but with a sudden lethal readiness. It was a subtle shift, a tensing of muscle that only someone this close could feel. His gaze didn't break from mine. For a heartbeat the world stopped. I saw a flicker of something in those dark depths, not just recognition, but a grim, respect-filled assessment. "3 near the kitchen too," I added, my voice trembling but holding. "They're waiting for the signal." I pulled my hand back, clutching a final piece of glass that bit deep into my thumb. The blood was hot and real, a sharp contrast to the cold calculation of the room. I bowed my head again, the perfect image of a broken girl, while beneath the table, I saw Kaito's hand slide toward his own waist. Arthur, sensing he was being left out of the interaction, stepped forward, his voice regaining its oily bravado. "I apologize for the disturbance, Mr. Vane. This girl is being removed immediately. She won't trouble you further." Kaito didn't move. He remained leaned in, his eyes still locked on mine, a predator who had just been handed a map of the minefield. The glass in my hand felt like a detonator. I had said the words. I had crossed the line. There was no going back to nursing school or double shifts. The war I had warned him about was no longer a possibility. It was starting in 5 seconds. Arthur, emboldened by Kaito's silence, mistook the heavy stillness for permission to finish his performance. He saw a powerful man leaning in to inspect a mess, and in his desperate bid to prove his competence, he decided that the stain needed to be scrubbed away immediately. He stepped forward, his face flushed with a petty, righteous heat. "I said get out," Arthur roared, his voice cracking the expensive atmosphere of the dining room. Before I could move, his hand shot out, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of my uniform at the shoulder. The force was sudden and violent, jerking me upward. I gasped as the shards of glass still in my hand scraped against my palm, the silver tray clattering to the floor with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the pressurized silence. He wasn't just firing me anymore. He was dragging me, a physical manifestation of every humiliation I'd endured during those endless double shifts. "You're a disgrace to this floor," Arthur hissed, his spit hitting my cheek as he yanked me toward the kitchen. "I'll personally walk you to the curb." But he didn't get more than 2 steps. A hand, cold and steady as a vice, clamped around Arthur's wrist. The movement was so fast it was almost invisible, a blur of black fabric and tattooed skin. Arthur's momentum stopped instantly. His arm jolted back with a force that made his elbow lock. The dining room went dead silent. The man at table 4 froze, his hand halfway inside his jacket. The men near the kitchen paused, their eyes darting to the center of the room. Kaito Vane didn't stand up. He remained seated, his posture relaxed, almost casual, even as he held the manager's arm in a grip that looked capable of snapping bone. He looked up at Arthur, his obsidian eyes devoid of anger, replaced by something far more terrifying, absolute indifference. "You're making a lot of noise, Arthur," Kaito said. His voice was smooth, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly in the gut. "It's bad for the digestion, Mr. Vane." I was just..." Arthur's bravado evaporated, his face turning a sickly, translucent white. He tried to pull his arm back, but Kaito didn't budge. The manager's fingers reflexively loosened their grip on my shoulder, and I stumbled back, my heart hammering against my ribs. "She's clumsy, sir," Arthur stammered, his voice climbing an octave. "She's a nobody. I was just removing the only thing being removed tonight is you," Kaito interrupted. He finally stood, a slow, fluid rising that seemed to take up all the light in the room. He didn't let go of Arthur's wrist. Instead, he leaned in, his face inches from the manager's terrified eyes. "She wasn't cleaning the floor. She was doing your job. She was watching the room while you were busy listening to the sound of your own voice." Kaito's gaze flickered to me for a fraction of a second, a silent confirmation of the warning I'd whispered, before returning to Arthur. "Take your hand off her. Before I decide you don't need it anymore." Arthur's fingers flew away from me as if I were made of white-hot iron. He was shaking now, a full-body tremor that made his expensive suit look like a costume. Kaito finally released him, not with a shove, but with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He turned his back on the manager, completely exposing himself to the hitmen at table 4, and looked at me. The dragon on his neck seemed to coil in the dim light. "Stay behind me, Sloane," he said quietly. It wasn't a request. It was the first time in my life someone had offered me a shield instead of a tray. Behind us, the man at table 4 stood up, and the glint of steel was no longer a secret. The atmospheric hum of the gilded lotus didn't just fade. It died. One moment, there was the distant clinking of silverware and the low murmur of oblivious wealth. The next, there was only the sound of the storm battering the glass, a frantic rhythmic drumming that matched the blood thudding in my ears. I stepped behind Kaito, my hand reflexively catching the sleeve of his black suit jacket. The fabric felt cool and impossibly expensive, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from his body. At table 4, the man in the gray suit was no longer pretending. He stood fully, his chair scraping against the marble with a sound like a scream. The suppressed pistol in his hand was a dark, ugly thing, silhouetted against the white tablecloths. Across the room, near the kitchen, the 3 shadows I'd spotted earlier stepped out from the columns, their movements shedding the guise of customers for the rigid, lethal posture of soldiers. "They're moving," I whispered, my voice caught in the back of my throat. Kaito didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon, though I knew he was armed. He simply stood there, a mountain of black ink and tailored wool, shielding me from the center of the room. He looked at the man at table 4 with a terrifyingly bored expression, as if this were a tiresome negotiation rather than an execution. "Cleared your napkins. You've lost the rhythm, Lee." "You're late," Kaito said, his voice carrying through the silent room like a low-frequency hum. "The girls saw you before you even cleared your napkins. You've lost the rhythm, Lee. The man at table 4, Lee, didn't answer. His eyes flickered to me for a fraction of a second, a look of pure, concentrated venom. I was the variable they hadn't accounted for. I was the nobody who had derailed $1 million contract with a 5-word whisper. In that gaze, I realized that if I survived the next 60 seconds, I would never be able to go back to the life where I was invisible. I was a target now, too. Arthur, meanwhile, had collapsed into a nearby booth. His face a translucent shade of green. His hands over his ears as if he could drown out the reality of the guns. He was a small man who had played at being a king, now realizing he was just a bug beneath the heels of giants. "Drop it!" a voice boomed from the entrance. Kaito's 2 charcoal-suited guards had their weapons drawn, a perfect crossfire established before the hitmen could even level their sights. The standoff was a physical weight, a tension so thick it felt like the air might spontaneously combust. No one breathed. The jazz quartet had vanished, their instruments abandoned like skeletons on the stage. Lightning flashed again, turning the dining room into a strobe-lit nightmare of bone-white light and obsidian shadow. Kaito took a single step forward, pulling me with him. He didn't look at the guns pointed at his chest. He looked at the room as if he already owned it. "The trap is broken," he said, his voice dropping to a jagged, lethal whisper. "Now we see who survives the fallout." The air in the Gilded Lotus didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt hollowed out, as if Kaito Vane's presence had consumed every remaining scrap of Arthur Sterling's authority. The manager was still huddled in the booth, a trembling heap of expensive wool and cheap ambition, staring at the drawn guns with a glazed, uncomprehending terror. He was waiting for the world to return to a version where he was the one who decided who stayed and who went. He didn't realize that version had been executed the moment the glass hit the floor. Kaito didn't look back at the hitmen. He kept his eyes on Arthur, a steady, predatory focus that was more unnerving than the weapons leveled at his chest. With a slow, deliberate motion, Kaito reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The hitmen tensed, but Kaito didn't pull a gun. He pulled a heavy, gold-embossed fountain pen and a single, folded sheet of parchment. "You called her a stain, Arthur," Kaito said, his voice a low, melodic threat that cut through the thunder outside. "You called her a nobody. But while you were measuring the distance between your finger and her face, I was measuring the distance between your incompetence and my patience." He tossed the parchment onto the table in front of Arthur. It landed with a soft, final thud. "Read the bottom line," Kaito commanded. Arthur's hand shook so violently, he nearly tore the paper as he unfolded it. His eyes darted across the text, his mouth falling open as the realization hit him like a physical blow. This is a deed of transfer. The holding company. They sold an hour ago," Kaito replied, leaning in until his shadow completely swallowed the manager. "I don't like waiting for reservations, so I bought the building. Which means the floor you're standing on, the air you're breathing, and the contract you think gives you the right to scream at this woman. All of it belongs to me." The shift in the room was tectonic. The waitstaff, who had been frozen in the shadows, looked at one another with a dawning, fearful hope. Arthur looked up, his face a ghostly mask of ruin. "Mr. Vane, I can explain. I was just maintaining the standards of—" "You have no standards," Kaito interrupted, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "You have a title you didn't earn and a power you use to break people smaller than you. But today you met someone who isn't small." Kaito reached out and plucked the manager's silver general manager pin from his lapel, the metal snapping with a sharp, satisfying crack. He turned to me, his gaze softening by a fraction of a degree, not into kindness but into a grim, shared understanding. He pressed the pin into my blood-stained palm, his fingers warm against my skin. "Sloane isn't sacked, Arthur. You are." Kaito straightened his jacket, his obsidian eyes flicking toward the entrance. "Get out. Don't go to the back. Don't collect your things. If I see your face in this zip code after the rain stops, I'll consider it a personal insult." Arthur didn't argue. He scrambled out of the booth, stumbling toward the doors without a single backward glance at the empire he'd lost in a single hour. He vanished into the storm, a broken man lost in the dark. Kaito turned back to the room, the standoff still humming like a live wire. He didn't look like a customer anymore. He looked like the owner of a battlefield, and I was the only person he'd chosen to spare. The silence that followed Arthur's departure was heavier than the storm. Kaito didn't lower his guard, but the lethal edge of his posture softened as he turned to fully face me. The hitmen were gone, neutralized or vanished into the shadows like ghosts, leaving only the staff who watched from the periphery with wide, hollow eyes. I looked down at the silver manager's pin in my hand, the sharp metal digging into my palm, mixing with the drying blood of my earlier sacrifice. It was a heavy, cold weight. "You're bleeding," Kaito said. His voice wasn't gentle, but it lacked the razor-wire threat he had used for Arthur. It was a simple statement of fact, an observation of a wound sustained in his service. "I'm fine," I whispered, though my knees felt like they were made of water. I tried to smooth my apron, but the fabric was stained, a dark map of the night's chaos. I should probably start cleaning the tables. "The night isn't over." Kaito reached out, his hand hovering near my elbow before settling with a firm, grounding pressure. "The night is over for the Gilded Lotus, Sloane. And it's over for the version of you that cleans up after men who aren't fit to speak your name." He began to walk toward the exit, his pace unhurried, pulling me along in his wake. I didn't resist. My locker, my books, my old life. It all felt like it belonged to a girl I hadn't seen since the glass shattered. As we reached the heavy brass doors, the two guards stepped forward, pushing them open to reveal a world of swirling gray and neon reflections. The Chicago rain was a wall of water, drenching the sidewalk in seconds. I flinched, expecting the cold shock to hit my skin, but it never came. One of the guards had stepped out ahead of us, a massive black umbrella blooming over our heads like a silk canopy. Kaito stopped at the edge of the curb where a sleek, obsidian SUV waited, its engine a low, predatory hum against the thunder. He turned to me, the golden light from the restaurant catching the cross at his throat. "Nursing school," he said, his obsidian eyes searching mine. "3 semesters left, you said?" I nodded, stunned that he had been listening when I thought he was only watching for assassins. "Finish it," he commanded. "But you won't do it on a waitress's tips. You saw what my men missed tonight. You have eyes that see the truth in a room full of lies. That's a rare currency in my world." He leaned in closer, the scent of rain and expensive tobacco enveloping me. "I need a medic I can trust. Someone who doesn't blink when the glass breaks. Come with me, and I'll ensure your father gets the best care in the city. In return, you stay by my side." It wasn't a fairy tale. It was a contract signed in blood and crystal. I looked back at the warm golden glow of the restaurant, the cage I had spent months trying to escape, and then at the dark, open door of the vehicle. I took a breath, the air tasting of ozone and freedom. For the first time, I didn't bow my head. I stepped out of the shadows of the Gilded Lotus and into the rain, but this time I wasn't the one holding the tray. Someone else held the umbrella, and for the first time in my life, I was walking toward a future I had chosen for myself. The SUV glided through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, the neon city lights bleeding across the window in streaks of electric blue and violent crimson. Inside the cabin, the silence was absolute, a heavy, pressurized quiet that felt safe rather than suffocating. For the first time in years, the crushing weight of the next bill, the next shift, and the next insult from a man like Arthur had simply vanished. Kaito Vane sat beside me, his profile etched in the shifting shadows of the passing street lamps. He didn't look at me, but his presence was a constant, grounding force. He was a man who lived in the center of a storm, yet he moved with a stillness that suggested he had mastered the wind itself. I looked down at my hands, still faintly trembling, and then at the silver manager's pin I still clutched. Felt like a relic from a past life. You're thinking about the restaurant, Kaito said. His voice a low vibration that broke the silence. Don't. The Gilded Lotus was a cage designed to keep you small. You've outgrown it. I was just a waitress an hour ago, I whispered, my voice sounding foreign in the luxury of the vehicle. I was a second away from being on the street. Now, my father is being moved to a private suite, and I'm sitting in the back of a car with a man the city is afraid of. It doesn't feel real. Kaito finally turned his head, his obsidian eyes locking onto mine. Real is what you make of the hand you're dealt, Sloane. You chose to speak when others would have looked away. You chose to save a man who didn't deserve it. That choice has a price, but it also has a reward. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a jagged, intimate depth. From tonight on, you aren't just a survivor. You are under my protection. That means your enemies are my enemies. Your father's health is my priority. And your future. It's no longer written by men like Arthur Sterling. The SUV slowed to a stop in front of a high-rise that pierced the clouds, a monolith of glass and steel. A valet stepped forward, holding a massive black umbrella, ready to shield us from the world. Kaito stepped out first, then reached back, offering his hand. It wasn't the gesture of a boss to a subordinate. It was an invitation to appear. As I took his hand and stepped onto the dry pavement, I looked up at the sky. The thunder was still rolling, but I no longer flinched at the sound. The black waitress who was about to be sacked was gone, buried under the shattered crystal and the rain of the Gilded Lotus. In her place was a woman who had seen the glint of steel and didn't blink. Kaito led the way into the lobby, his long coat billowing behind him. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing us into the heights of the city, I caught my reflection in the polished gold of the panel. I looked tired, bloodied, and worn, but for the first time I looked like someone who finally knew exactly who she was. The story hadn't just changed. It was finally mine to write.